a significant episcopal act, the first step in the evolutional movement toward a permanent type of yearly conference, belongs to the record of this year. That was the meeting of the works in South Carolina and Georgia into what was afterwards known as the South Carolina Conference. But at this time, there were neither conference names nor boundaries, though the last section of the old colonial empire, except New England, to be invaded by the Methodists, South Carolina and Georgia were yet the first integrants of Methodism to be thrown into permanent conference shape. Savannah was made a station and put in charge of Hope Hull, who had wrought so effectively the year before in New England. Thus, nearly 60 years after John Wesley had left the capital of Oglethorpe between sons, a Methodist was again there to combat the vanities and follities of this world. After leaving Savannah and passing up through the Carolinas, Asbury again accomplished his long and perilous journey across the mountains into the wild new territory of Tennessee and the distant settlements in Kentucky. By the end of the summer he had, in returning, crept again over those stony barriers, and had again completed the round of New England, in which, little while ago, unpromising field, he was comforted with the reports of many conversions. By the beginning of autumn he was in Philadelphia, now being visited by a scourge of yellow fever. Unhindered and unterrified, he entered the stricken city, prayed, delivered his message, and then went his way to answer other calls. There is a limit to human enduring, and this Francis Asbury was forced, though reluctantly, to acknowledge. Diseased and broken, he was compelled during 1794 to give up his accustomed circuit of the Republic. He dared not attempt, in his enfeebled condition, the passage of the American Alps, as he termed the Triple Appalachian Ranges, but contented himself chiefly with visitations through those states which had made his circuit before the meeting of the Christmas conference. The preachers from distant fields met him at halfway points, and there he planned their stations and directed their future movements. An enforced inactivity of many weeks occurred during January and February, and this season was spent in the genial climate of Charleston. Practical and matter-of-fact though he was, there was yet in the makeup of Asbury an element of the dreamer and idealist. This was that in him which ran to the seer. Concluding with his faith, it enabled him to see results before they were attained. It gave fascination to adventure and made enticing the enterprise of the impossible. The distant treadings of his unseen itinerants through mountains and valleys, remote, were a perpetual echo of music in his thoughts. He also had the rare faculty of divining the spirits, and knew the men whose feet would echo thus. Okay, I didn't expect that. Well, they mean something different than what people will typically mean. They mean, he had a way of figuring out, how to get people spiritually on his side. In March 1794, he writes, I provided brothers Gibson and Lurton for the westward. That was Tobias Gilson, and never was word of command laid upon a more intrepid soldier. The word westward had for him a soul-entrancing sound. In 1800, with the call of the new century, he rode to the settlements on the Cumberland. There produced a frail boat, which he paddled down the Cumberland, the Ohio, and thence into the Mississippi, in which stream he continued until he came to the Natchez country, where through successive years he labored and laid the foundations of Methodism. In that then more than romantic region, death early called him to his rest. His dust sleeps within hearing of the eternal roll of the tides of the river, along whose banks he sowed the enduring seed. The conference held this year in New England was a notable one. After preaching in Boston, where he assured himself that Methodists would yet have a work, in company with Robert R. Roberts, afterwards one of the bishops of the church, Asbury came to Wilbraham and met the preachers. Not a few of the men famous in the early history of Methodism were in that little gathering. Besides Roberts and Lee were Ostrander, Mudge, Taylor, and Hall. Stevens, the historian, stopped in his narrative to make special mention of these names of men who led the triumphs of Israel in the land of the East. Experience had taught Asbury and the brethren much wisdom in the arrangement of the conferences. At first there was an unnecessary waste of time and a needless multiplication of meetings. But the districts were now so consolidated that for 1795 only 7 sittings were appointed, as against 20, and even more in some previous years. All the frontier work was united in one body, called the Western District. This made it necessary for the bishop to make but one point beyond the mountains, where all the preachers gathered into a single assembly, made not only an effective show, but held a helpful fellowship. This year, the heart of Asbury was deeply saddened by news of the death of Justice White of Delaware, his benefactor and protector in the times of strife and war. He was a friend to the poor and oppressed. He had been a professed churchman and was united to the Methodist connection about 17 or 18 years. Was in part the simple eulogy passed upon him by a simple-hearted friend and bishop. In a lot of cases, you find that the law in America is sort of decided by church folk. I mean, far more than their population might lead you to think. It's decided more by businesses nowadays, but it was about this time also that the Journal of Asbury noted the death of Richard Harry Lee, a great politician who was active in promoting the independence of the United States. It is significant that in the same connection he sighed over the impotency of the measures, political and ecclesiastical, for dealing with the cause of slavery. The men who made the Republic had their own notions about slavery, but left the problem, with all its perils, to the men of an after time. Freeborn Garrison, the Roland of the itinerancy, had married a woman of wealth, and was settled in a sumptuous home on the Hudson, but was still loyal to his call as a Methodist preacher, and continued so to the end of his life. Descending the country from his episcopal visitations in New England, Asbury was entertained in the Garretson home, and also tarried a day with his longtime friend, Governor Van Cortlandt, whose manor was in the same quarter. Van Cortlandt was one of the truly great figures of his day. He had won renown in public life, but was heartily religious. He was a tower of strength to the Methodists. In his home, Washington, Lafayette, and other distinguished men had been entertained, but they were not made more welcome than were the itinerants. Whitefield had several times been his guest, and from the balconies of his mansion had addressed a multitude of people. The highest compliment with which Asbury could pay to this courtly publicist and hearty Methodist layman was that he reminded him of General Russell, the pioneer soldier Christian, now sleeping under the sod of the far-away Holston Valley. Now, where's the Holston Valley exactly? At least we know it's a valley now. There were disputes about some of the potential state names, or there were areas of some states that wanted to be their own state, and so I don't. But it's a valley, okay. Bishop Coke was expected in the country to preside over the General Conference of 1796. Asbury therefore began, in the autumn of the previous year, his 7th round of the connection, with the feeling that relief from the great burden he was carrying was soon to be afforded by his colleague and his brethren. It seems incredible that he should have been left so long without episcopal assistance, but more incredible that at the next General Conference the episcopacy was not strengthened. But why it was not done will be seen when we come to review in their place the proceedings of that body. It becomes now no longer necessary to follow the apostolic pioneer around his 6,000 miles of circuit. He had come to know the passes of the American Alps and the paths of the wilderness as seamen know the sea. Well, they thought the Appalachians and stuff were high. What were they going to think of the Rockies? Because the Appalachians are pretty low as mountains are concerned. Each year, he pushed his own advance a little farther westward, and flung the battle line a stage beyond his own going. Each year, too, a step farther northward, as a step farther southward pressed the vanguards, which he was all but daily recruiting, and still he declared it impossible to supply preachers for the work. In the south, the itinerants were in sight of the Spanish possessions, and in the north they were invading the province of Maine, and pushing up the courses of the Canadian rivers. At the turn of the year, word came from Jesse Lee that the bulwarks in New England were giving way, and that even Boston was receiving the Methodists. Asbury estimated that this year there were 70,000 Methodists in America and the West Indies. The minutes showed a total of nearly 300 preachers connected with the work. When 25 years before Asbury entered upon his labors in the New World, there were with himself and Richard Wright, his fellow missionary, but 8 Methodist preachers on the continent, and scarcely 500 members in society. Well, we can definitely honor them as a movement that understood that to change the ethical behavior of a nation or their situation in, in well-being terms more than, some more materialistic terms. Well, that, if you're looking after the poor and stuff, but anyways, you gotta address the people. Of course, you do gotta address those at the top, at the same time, but they're really focused on trying to produce an effect in the masses. A memory of his initial days of service in America was revived to him this year. The Episcopal round closed with the conference in Philadelphia, and here Asbury had the pleasure to receive, as a visitor at the conference, his old-time comrade in arms, Joseph Pilmore, who was now a rector of a Protestant Episcopal parish in the city of brotherly love. The ex-itinerant was not only cordially received, but was invited to preach, and Asbury expressed gratification at hearing such wholesome talk from his plain countrymen, say, ground up. And now, having learned through the medium of the newspapers that Dr. Koch had reached Baltimore, he rode to Perry Hall, where he gave himself up to a rest of both mind and body. Despite their sometimes sharp differences, there subsided between Koch and Asbury a deep and sincere personal affection. Asbury not only admired the great and commanding talents of his colleague, but cherished a profound respect for his faithful and unselfish zeal in the cause of God. For his own part, Koch regarded Asbury as being next to Wesley the most apostolic man he had ever known. It is certain that Asbury always breathed easier and felt a sure confidence when his colleague was within easy access. In an entry in his journal touching the General Conference, which met a few days later, he says, Bishop Koch was cordially received as my friend and colleague, to be wholly for America unless a way should be opened to France. About 100 preachers reported at the opening of the General Conference. A new rule cut off not only a few, and many eligibles were too remote to undertake the long journey, but the giants were there, and the old battle on the episcopal prerogative had to be fought over. Asbury described it as a stroke at the presiding eldership. There is no record of what this stroke was exactly, but a latter time developed it into a matter known and read of all men. The entire work was now divided, or rather consolidated, into 6 annual conferences with definite boundaries and distinct names. These conferences were the New England, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Virginia, South Carolina, and Western. The first, as its name indicated, included all New England. The Philadelphia Conference included all of New York, the eastern third of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and the eastern shore of Maryland. In the Baltimore Conference were found those parts of Pennsylvania and Maryland not included in the Philadelphia Conference. The entire state of Virginia and the northern half of North Carolina were designated as the Virginia Conference. I presume they mean like past that group of Smoky Mountains, right? Is it the Smoky Mountains? It's like Asheville and that one Grandfather Mountain and all that. While the remaining half of North Carolina and all of South Carolina and Georgia went to make up the South Carolina Conference. Kentucky and Tennessee were described as the Western Conference, and now it was that the interpretive jurisprudence of Methodism began. By vote of the General Conference, the bishops were directed to prepare explanatory notes on the various sections, rules, and provisions of the discipline. This was done, and the notes were printed in the 10th edition, the one bearing data of 1798, and from these notes have grown the official manuals and other expanded commentaries on Methodist law and constitution used in the various branches of the Church today. Bishop Asbury expected and desired the election by the General Conference of one or more assistant bishops, but he set his ideal so high that the body hesitated to act. Not indeed that there were not men in the body who felt that a fit man could be found, but the few who felt that way were unable to concentrate the judgment of the majority. Asbury was then asked to select his own colleague or colleagues. So this kind of indicates that the apostolic thing is not quite an accurate term. This he steadily declined to do, and the problem was thereby made more difficult of handling than before. It was at this junction that Dr. Koch came forward with a proposition that seemed to offer an instant and complete solution. His relations in Europe had been strained for some time, and he was doubtful as to what his future course should be. He now agreed to settle in America and give his whole time to assisting Bishop Asbury, except when he should be engaged in looking after the missions in the West Indies or France. The preachers were much divided as to the wisdom of adopting this course. In fact, as we have seen, there was much opposition to Dr. Koch, and his apparent neglect of the Americans had not helped to remove this feeling. But as he was already a bishop of the church, and now agreed to serve under terms satisfactory to his brethren, and as Bishop Asbury strongly urged the adoption of that course, no bishop was elected, and Dr. Koch's proffered services were accepted. This arrangement promised much for Asbury's relief, but it was disappointing almost to the last degree. The two bishops proceeded together on the round of the conferences until February of 1797, when Dr. Koch sailed for Europe, to return within a short while, and thereafter, as both he and the brethren expected, take up his permanent residence in the New World. Asbury was, at this time, suffering acutely from his old maladies, and during this year was in bed oftener and longer than during any previous period. He was confined fully 6 months out of the 12, and sorrowfully records that he was able to travel during the year not above 3,000 miles. He was also much weighed down with general despondency. The going away of his colleague caused him deep regret. Tomorrow, he says, my dear Koch sails for Europe. Strangers to the delicacies of Christian friendship know little or nothing of the pain of parting. One hears that sort of sentiment probably strongest in the whole Rumi and Shamsa Tabriz situation. Beyond any question, Dr. Koch was sincere in his desire and purpose to return and become a settled bishop in America, but in Europe he found conditions that he had not supposed existed. He was in fact agreeably surprised to discover that his brethren in Ireland and England were demanding his release from the obligation given the Americans, that he might serve the homeland. A year before, he had believed his welcome in Great Britain to be gone. The happy discovery of this preference confused his feelings and left him in a strait betwixt two. So it was that the invalid Asbury was left to struggle on through his year of toils, with none to share the heavy demands of his office. On September 23rd, which is sort of like a birthday for me, he made this entry in his journal. I received a letter from Dr. Coke, as I thought. So it is. He is gone from Ireland to England, and will have work enough when he cometh here. It is a doubt if the doctor cometh to America until spring, if at all, until the General Conference. I am more than ever convinced of the propriety of the attempts I have made to bring forward the Episcopal men. One thing is clear from the above, and from other like records, namely that Asbury did not hesitate to propose a particular man for the episcopacy. Whether or not he was wise in his doing so in his time, it is now impossible to say, but a modern Methodist sentiment has ruled strongly against nominations for the episcopal office. Giving up hope of help from his colleague, Asbury turned as before to a solitary task. He attempted to meet the preachers in the Western Conference and even crossed the mountains, but was forced to return, leaving the administration to the presiding elders. More than once he was forced to call an elder to hold the conferences in Virginia and other states. Jesse Lee was his trusted substitute, and at this time he strongly favored Lee for the episcopacy. But when, in 1800, Lee failed of election, he and his friends were inclined to charge his defeat upon Asbury. The story is one of painful human misunderstandings. To Asbury's surprise, no doubt, Dr. Coke did return to the continent in the autumn of 1797. On November 15th, he presided at the session of the Virginia Conference, and to that body presented an official letter from the conference in England asking for his release from the obligation to reside in America. This, it was not the providence of a yearly conference to grant, but the preachers gave their personal consent to an abrogation of the agreement. Dr. Coke remained on the continent until the following spring, preaching and doing the work of a bishop. He then sailed for Europe and returned not until the General Conference of 1800. The year 1798 had a cheerless opening for Asbury. He was still extremely feeble and felt that his end was nigh. Weak in body, nervous, and unable to read or study, he employed himself in winding spool cotton and talking to the children and slaves of the home in which he was a guest. His mind was abroad in the vast new lands where the scattered churches needed his fostering oversight. But heaven had decreed in him months of inactivity, and these he spent in fireside ministry to the little ones, sublime adaptation. At times he was able to do stints of work, and such times he put on his journal, preparing it for publication. The book business of the church had greatly prospered, but alas, the faithful book steward, John Dickens, who to Asbury was as another soul, this year fell a victim to the yellow fever and was gathered to his rest. This, and news from England of the death of his aged father, added heaviness to the continued bodily afflictions from which he suffered. As the year advanced, his strength increased, and he was again able to take up his visitations, but he determined to give himself to the simple work of attending the conference sessions. The last conference of the year was held in New England, where 50 preachers assembled. Such had been the growth of the work in the short space of 7 years. It was at this conference that Lorenzo Dow was received on trial as a traveling preacher and begun his extraordinary career. With the close of this conference, Asbury turned slowly toward the south and entered upon a short midwinter stay in Charleston, which he had come to regard with an affection and interest only second to that which he cherished for Baltimore. The episcopal work for the next year, 1799, was curtailed somewhat. 6 conferences only were appointed, and these were scheduled to sit between January and July. A note appearing in the minutes of 1798 and 1799 reads, Jesse Lee travels with Bishop Asbury. In previous years, the bishop had seldom traveled without a companion. Henry Willis had ridden with him in 1785 on his first episcopal tour. McKendry had accompanied him in 1792, while in 1790, Watcote had with him crossed the mountains into the new territory and had shared his hardships and all but tragic adventures. Lee and Roberts and Hull had gone with him about New England, and no journey had ever been made to the southwest without companionship. But the conference appointed of a regular chaplain spoke the extreme point to which his strength had wasted. Lee took the burden of his work, the preaching, the presiding, when the bishop's was not equal to the demand. In a word, the plan was to ease him of everything except the stationing of the preachers and the ordinations. More than once, Lee went forward and held the conferences, Asbury having drafted the stations and anticipated as best he could from his sick room the difficulties of administration. Oh, maybe he didn't. Maybe they did mean the Rockies, but without cars and stuff like this, it's the Appalachians are still a feat,